They had experience, they had degrees, they had the tools, the formulas, the titles. 10 of them, each trained to solve the unsolvable. But after weeks of failure, confusion, and dead ends, hope was slipping. Then she walked in. No credentials. No authority, just a quiet presence they barely noticed. And yet, what she carried was something none of them did. A different way of seeing. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it was history in the making. This is the story of a woman the world almost ignored, until her brilliance left even the experts in silence. They didn't see her when she walked in, not really. They saw the plain clothes, quiet steps, the notebook pressed tightly against her chest. They saw the kind of woman they could overlook without consequence. No badge, no title. No reason in their minds to believe she had anything worth saying. She wasn't dressed like a genius. She wasn't talking like one either. She was just simple. And to them, simplicity meant weakness, irrelevance, a waste of time. So they chuckled under their breath. One smirked, another checked his watch. The youngest engineer whispered something to the guy beside him, and they both laughed. A room full of intellect, data, and degrees, but not an ounce of humility. And yet there she stood, silent eyes scanning the blueprint no one else had been. Able to decode? 10 of the brightest minds had stared at that same design for 3 weeks straight. Nothing worked. The system failed every time. The math didn't add up. Structure couldn't hold. The flow collapsed at every turn. But she saw something they couldn't. She didn't have their training. She had something else, clarity born from struggle, not schooling. She'd spent years fixing what others broke, not with fancy tech, but with instinct. With patience. With patterns learned from listening when no one else did. She wasn't loud because she never needed to be. She was overlooked her whole life, so she learned to look deeper. And what she saw in that diagram was the one flaw no one thought. To question, her hand rose slowly, not to interrupt, but to offer. A soft voice, clear but unsure. I think you've all been measuring from the wrong anchor point. The laughter stopped. Briefly, then someone replied, trying not to chuckle. We've calculated this 100 times. It's not the anchor. It's the load. But she didn't argue. She just stepped forward, gently set her notebook on the table, and began drawing. Not equations, just a line. A line no one had drawn before, and then another. And suddenly, their design took a new shape. The tension in the room shifted. The room, once filled with certainty, began to crack. One of the older engineers leaned in, another walked around to see her diagram better. Then, silence. Not because she proved them wrong, but because in that moment, they realized they had never even considered being wrong. 10 minds, trapped. In the same thinking, one woman brave enough to see with fresh eyes. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply stepped back and waited. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. It was the quiet power of someone who spent her life being ignored but never stopped paying attention. They laughed at her simplicity because they didn't understand its depth. But in that silence that followed her sketch, the truth was louder than any title in the room. She had seen what no one else could. Not because she was better, but because she was willing to look where no one else bothered to. For weeks, the room had been filled with nothing but tension, equations, and failure. These weren't just any engineers. They were the best of the best, handpicked, highly paid, and celebrated in their fields. Each one had credentials that filled pages. They spoke in algorithms, coded their sentences with confidence, and believed that if anyone could solve IT, it would be them. And yet, the answer never came. Not after hours of simulations, not after nights spent buried under blueprints and stress. They had tried everything they knew, every theory, every formula, every approach backed by experience, logic, and reason. But still, the system broke. Every single time. The pressure grew heavier with every failure. Their pride disguised it as frustration, but it was fear of being outsmarted, of being proven human. They were drowning in a problem too stubborn to bend, too complex to yield. Then she walked in. No announcement, no applause. Just the soft sound of her shoes against the tile floor. Her presence was quiet, almost apologetic, like she wasn't sure she belonged. But her eyes, those eyes, didn't look lost. They looked like they'd been here before. Like they had seen complexity before, and weren't intimidated by it. She carried no briefcase, no laptop, just a small, worn notebook in her hand, and the kind of calm that doesn't come from training but from surviving. The room barely noticed her at first. One engineer glanced up, then back down. Another kept typing. She was just a guest. They assumed maybe someone's assistant, maybe the catering. But she wasn't there to serve. She was there to see. 2. Understand what they couldn't. She didn't ask questions like a student. She asked questions that made them pause. Why is the margin of error only measured from one side? Have you considered the thermal expansion under field conditions, not lab simulations? Her voice was soft, but it didn't need volume. It had gravity. With each observation, she pulled them further from the world they thought they understood and deeper into the one she actually saw. They tried to brush her off at first, a chuckle here, dismissive nod there, but they kept listening. Something about her words didn't just challenge their thinking, it unsettled it. Not because she made them feel small, but because she was, making the problem feel smaller, that terrified them. She asked if she could try something. The lead engineer hesitated, then handed her the marker. The room fell into a stillness that felt sacred. She walked to the board, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, like she had waited her whole life to be taken seriously. Then she began to draw. Not to impress, but to clarify. Line by line, she reconstructed the problem, not how they had seen it, but how it actually was. She spotted where their logic had looped back into itself, creating false positives and blind spots. She saw the system, not just the symbols. When she finished, she stepped back and said just 4 words. Try it this way. The room didn't respond immediately. They didn't know how. For the first time in weeks, they were staring at something that made sense. Something elegant in its simplicity, but genius in its depth. One engineer leaned forward, whispered, "How did we miss that?" Another said it was right there, but it wasn't. Not for them. Not until she showed them. They weren't. Defeated, they were stunned. In a room full of brilliance, it was the quietest voice that finally broke the silence. 10 brilliant minds had tried and failed. Then she walked in, and everything changed. Asterisk. She didn't come with a title. She didn't carry credentials in her name or letters after it. She didn't walk with the weight of accolades or introduce herself with a resume. She came with lived experience, with wounds that taught more than textbooks ever could. Never trained to solve problems like this, but life had made her a solver anyway. Not in pristine labs or clean conference rooms, but in the mess of reality. In the chaos of small moments where things broke and no one else was coming to fix them. So when they said she's not an engineer, they weren't wrong. But they were incomplete. Because while she lacked their degrees, she had something far rarer, the ability to see the heart of a problem without getting blinded by its complexity. The system they couldn't fix wasn't just technical, it was layered with assumptions. Their minds were trapped in their own brilliance, looping logic through models and formulas that all made sense, but just didn't work. She didn't argue with the math. She looked at what had missed. She traced it back to the human factor. To the one overlooked variable no one had tested because they didn't think it mattered, but she knew it did. She always noticed what others ignored. Her mind worked differently, not in steps but in patterns, in intuition. In quiet realization built from watching, not guessing, from doing, not discussing. They had equations. She had clarity. Had blueprints. She had instincts. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to prove herself. It was to help. She didn't need them to believe her, just needed them to see. And they did. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Her words made them uncomfortable at first. Not because she was wrong, but because she was undeniably right in a way they hadn't been. It shook something in them. Pride, ego, the belief that only the qualified could create solutions. But now, the solution was standing right in front of them. She didn't fit their mold, but she fixed their mistake. She wasn't one of them, but in that moment, she was the only one who mattered. The moment they tested her solution, everything changed. What had failed over and over suddenly worked. Simulation ran clean. The margins aligned. Stress points held. The chaos that once defined the blueprint now folded into order. No one cheered. No one clapped. They just stared at her, at the result, the simplicity of it all. She turned away quietly, not waiting for applause. That was never the goal. She wasn't trying to be famous. She was just tired of watching the world overlook answers because they came from the wrong mouth. That day, a room full of experts saw something they'd forgotten, that wisdom doesn't always wear a badge. That brilliance can come wrapped in humility. That sometimes the person who doesn't belong on paper is the exact person the moment was waiting for. Wasn't an engineer, but she was everything the problem needed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't push her way into the conversation. She simply spoke, softly, clearly, and with intent. Her idea wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Yet in that room full of polished suits and sharp minds, it echoed as nothing more than background noise. They nodded politely, the way people do when they think they're being kind, but underneath their professional gestures was a current of dismissal. They had already decided she was out of place, out of line, out of her depth. The lead engineer looked at her suggestion with a smirk that wasn't mean, but wasn't respectful either. "Thanks," he said, scribbling something irrelevant on his pad. "But we've already optimized that sector." Another chimed in. "We've tried everything." The room nodded. Except they hadn't tried her everything. She didn't argue. She didn't beg to be heard. She just stepped back, holding her notebook close, and watched as they continued to chase solutions in the same dead circles. They adjusted calculations, reconfigured stress points, rebuilt models that collapsed in silence. Every few minutes, another sigh, another theory, another failure. And through it all, she remained quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd already said it. Sometimes the hardest part of being right is watching people suffer from being wrong, because they wouldn't listen. But life had taught her patience, and patience was her superpower. Hours passed. The board was filled with scribbles and frustrations. Simulations ran and crashed. Dead ends wrapped in technical brilliance. Then something strange happened. Of the junior engineers, frustrated and desperate, flipped back through the pages of his notes. He stopped, stared at a single line, her line, the adjustment she mentioned, the one they all brushed off. Ran a quick test on his screen. The result paused him. His brows furrowed. He adjusted one more variable. Ran it again. The margin error dropped, not slightly, but significantly. He didn't say anything yet, just whispered to himself, "That can't be," but it was. He stood up slowly and approached the lead engineer. "Sir, I think we need to try her adjustment." The room grew still. There was tension in the silence, the kind that creeps in when truth starts knocking louder than ego. The lead engineer frowned. "That's already been disproven," he muttered. But the junior didn't back down. "No, sir, we just never tried it her way." The lead sighed, then reluctantly nodded. "Fine, run it once." The input was changed. As the system began to run, the room leaned in, watching the screen like it held their careers in its code. Time ticked slower. The screen flickered through data, calculations, flow paths, stress indicators. It kept going. No crash, no warning signs. The system held. Strong, clean, aligned. Then it happened. The simulation completed. Successfully, the room didn't erupt. There was no dramatic applause. Just stunned, breathless silence. 10 engineers, all experts, stared at the screen, then at each other, and finally, at her, the same woman, whose words they dismissed, whose insight they ignored, whose voice they treated as a courtesy instead of a contribution. She had spoken once, they hadn't listened. Now the system was alive because she was right. The lead engineer took a slow step forward. He looked at her eyes, softer than before, voice lower. "You saw this from the start, didn't you?" She nodded once. "Yes." Exhaled. Not out of defeat, but of awakening. For the first time, he heard her. "There's something sacred In a moment like that, when truth speaks not in noise, but in undeniable results, she hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded. She had simply waited for the truth to reveal itself, and now it had. The same people who once looked past her now couldn't look away. What came alive on that screen wasn't just a system, it was a message. That the loudest voices aren't always the wisest. That credentials don't guarantee insight. That brilliance doesn't always come in a suit and tie. Sometimes it walks in quietly. Sometimes it speaks once. And sometimes it waits until the silence is ready to listen. They dismissed her words, but the system didn't. It heard her the first time. And when it finally came alive, the whole room did too. There was a time not long ago when that room felt colder than any winter she'd ever known. Not because of the temperature, but because of the looks. The glances that flicked over her and moved on, the side eyes, smirks behind cupped hands, the kind of dismissive silence that doesn't speak aloud but screams, "You don't belong here." That room, with its polished surfaces and framed accolades on every wall, had made her feel like a stranger in a place built for men who measured worth by titles and spoke fluently in jargon. They mocked her not with words, but with posture, with their polite interruptions, with the way they called her miss instead of by her name. The first time she tried to speak, they let her but didn't listen. They heard her voice, but not her message. Because in their eyes she was too soft to be sharp, too simple to be significant, too ordinary to be the answer. But now, that same room had changed. It hadn't moved. The chairs were still there. The whiteboards, the wires, and the noise. But the energy was different. Now it hummed with something unfamiliar. Reverence. The very air held its breath as she walked past the same table where they once ignored her. And this time, all eyes followed, not because she asked for attention, but because the truth had already claimed it for her. She didn't say, "I told you so," because that wasn't her style. Her victory didn't need a voice. It was already echoing in the eyes of every person who now saw her clearly for the first time. The simulation had proven her right. But what shook them wasn't just the data. It was the humility of a woman who never needed to be loud to be powerful. The same people who once leaned back in their chairs with skepticism now leaned forward with respect. The engineer who once rolled his eyes now lowered them. The one who made jokes at her expense now stayed silent, ashamed not by her success, but by his smallness in the face of it. The head of the team, a man known for never apologizing, stood with his arms crossed, no longer out of pride, but out of discomfort. He cleared his throat and said what no one had dared to until now: "We were wrong." 3 words, heavy, real, humbling, and she didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She just nodded and replied, "You just didn't see it yet." There's something deeply poetic about that moment. When the mocked becomes the master. When the outsider becomes the only one who understood the inside. When the one who was ignored becomes the voice they all remember. She hadn't changed. The room had. Her idea hadn't evolved. Her perception had. That shift, that pivot in energy, was the power of truth standing in a space where ego once ruled, and now ego had left the building. One of the youngest engineers. The same one who once dismissed her as just someone observing, now approached her. Not with pity, not with regret, it's curiosity. "How did you see it?" he asked. She thought for a moment, then answered. "I stopped looking for answers that made sense to everyone else and looked for the truth that made sense to me." He didn't reply. He just nodded slowly and backed away, changed. The board she once wasn't allowed to touch now held her design. Her lines, her mind etched in black ink for all to study. They didn't just see her solution now. They studied it. They memorized it. They began rewriting their models based on her work. It's the same work they once ignored. That room which once echoed with laughter and arrogance now echoed with quiet awe. Not because they feared her, because they respected her. It wasn't fear that makes respect powerful, it's humility. And they had just tasted it. She didn't need validation. She had come with nothing to prove. She simply wanted to help. But life has a strange way of rewarding those who serve with heart, not ego. Her moment wasn't just a win, it was a lesson carved into the air, a reminder that brilliance wears many faces. that sometimes wisdom walks in dressed as a woman with a worn notebook, that the greatest ideas don't always come from credentials, but from clarity, courage, and the willingness to be doubted. That room would never forget her again, not because she made them remember, but because they had seen what happens when a person is finally heard. They mocked her. But now, that same room, goes her name. Asterisk, at first no one said it out loud, but she could feel it. The discomfort when she asked questions. The subtle shift in posture when she stepped too close to the board. The way conversations would continue as if her presence was background noise. They didn't tell her to stop talking, but they hoped she would. That's how silence works in places like this. Not enforced, but expected. Stay in the corner. Watch. Don't contribute. Be polite. Be invisible. And if you do speak, speak small. Just enough to show you're paying attention, not enough to disrupt the flow. But she had spent too many years being quiet. Too many years biting her tongue while others spoke circles around the truth. Too many moments watching people with less insight, but louder voices lead systems straight into failure. So no, she didn't stay quiet. Not this time. She spoke not to challenge them, but to honor what she knew. It's not to win a debate, but to fix what was broken. And the moment her voice rose above the noise, even if gently, something shifted. First in her, then in them. First they brushed it off, of course. They minimized her input, buried her brilliance beneath layers of protocol and pride. But truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's forced underwater. And her truth, it didn't just surface, it soared. The solution she gave wasn't a theory. It worked, not just in that room, but beyond it. Word spread fast, faster than she expected. One department heard, then another. Engineers started sharing her diagrams in group chats. Leaders whispered her name in meetings. Someone emailed a clip of the simulation to a regional director. Within days, what was once dismissed as an outsider's guess became the central conversation. Of a national systems conference, her solution wasn't just acknowledged, it was studied, applauded, even envied. And then came the headlines. Not tabloid fluff or viral clickbait. Real recognition. An orthodox mind solves what experts couldn't. A system breakthrough sparks new engineering standard, and it came from a voice they almost ignored. Major tech publications requested interviews. One journal labeled her approach visionary. Another called it a quiet revolution. Her design was published, reviewed, and adopted into projects she was never invited to join. Irony never looked so poetic. They had wanted her silent, but now the world was listening. The very people who once wished she'd stay in the shadows were now adjusting their spotlights to fit her name on stage. Not because she demanded it, because brilliance speaks for itself, especially when it's patient. And yet she didn't bask in the noise. She didn't crave the attention. She had no time for ego, no interest in proving points. Her goal had never been recognition, it was resolution. But the headlines came anyway. Not because she chased them, but because the world was hungry for real stories. And hers was as real as it gets. She didn't just solve a problem. She rewrote the way they looked at problems. She reminded them that genius doesn't always come from degrees or decades in the field. Sometimes it comes from a woman who simply refuses to let silence steal what she knows. And now, they couldn't silence her even if they tried, because the world had already heard. She walked into that room unseen. Now her solution was being replicated across industries. They once saw her as noise. Now her name carried weight. This wasn't revenge. This was redemption. Quiet, unapologetic, and undeniable. She had spoken once. They ignored her. She spoke again. The world listened. She didn't speak in technical jargon. She didn't come wrapped in credentials. She wasn't the person you'd expect to walk into a room full of engineers and be taken seriously. She didn't fit their mold, and maybe that's why they barely looked up when she first walked in. She wasn't wearing a suit. She didn't carry a clipboard. She didn't bring a team of assistants or pages of data sheets. What she brought was different, a quiet kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, the kind that waits for the right moment. and then changes everything. The room had already been exhausted. 10 engineers, each with years of experience, had taken their turn. They had formulas. They had frameworks. They had everything except the answer. Days had turned into weeks. Meetings blurred together. Deadlines were slipping like sand through fingers. The pressure was rising. And just when everyone thought they had tried everything, she arrived. She wasn't invited. Not officially. She wasn't on the payroll. She didn't carry a title or a role within the organization. She was just someone who had been watching from the edges. Someone who paid attention not just to systems and structures, but to the spaces in between, the silences, the rhythms. The way problems spoke when no one was really listening. When she finally spoke, the words didn't come with authority. They came with understanding. She asked questions no one had thought to ask. Simple ones. It's obvious even. So obvious that the room nearly laughed again. But something in her tone made them pause. Not because it was commanding, but because it was right. It was rooted not in guesswork, but in grounded wisdom. She didn't offer a solution with arrogance. She offered it with humility, as if she wasn't trying to be right, but simply to help. Her solution was unconventional. It didn't fit the diagrams on the wall. It didn't match the algorithms they had been testing. It was too simple, too human. But when they tested it, when they allowed themselves to try something outside their rules, the system responded. It worked. It didn't just solve the problem. It revealed the flaw in everything they had been doing before. The silence that followed wasn't because they didn't understand. It was because they did. The first time in weeks, something made sense. All those degrees, all those years, all that experience, and yet, it took someone who didn't fit their standards to see what they'd missed. That day, the energy in the room shifted. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. You could feel the respect rising, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. She didn't come to prove herself. She came to solve a problem. And in doing so, she became something more than a solution bringer. She became the standard. People started referencing her method, her approach, the quiet logic in how she viewed complexity. They rewrote protocols based on the very thing they once dismissed. What was once too simple to be serious became the framework others began to follow. She never sought credit. She never stepped into the spotlight. But the spotlight found her, not because she chased it, but because the truth always finds a way to shine through. The same people who once looked past her now looked up to her. They didn't ask her where she studied, how she saw it. And that question, that shift, marked the beginning of something deeper. It wasn't just a win for her, it was a win for every outsider who ever walked into a room and felt invisible. For every person who's been told they don't fit the standard. For every voice that was talked over, every idea that was shelved because it didn't come in the right packaging. She represented a crack in the system, and through that crack, light poured in. She became the example people started pointing to in boardrooms and training sessions. Her story made its way into case studies, into leadership workshops, into conversations that once only made room for the elite. And still, she remained grounded. Still that same woman who didn't care for titles, who didn't need applause. She had done what 10 trained minds could not because she was better, but because she saw differently. In that difference, a new standard was born. Today, when people tell her story, they use words like innovator, genius, visionary. But she never used those words for herself. She just saw a problem, and where others saw complications, she saw clarity. The truth is, she didn't fail to meet their standards. Their standards failed to measure her. The system wasn't built to recognize her brilliance. But brilliance doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask for a seat. At the table, it builds its own. And that's exactly what she did. Her journey reminds us that expertise isn't always found in resumes or credentials. Sometimes it's found in people who've lived differently, listened deeper, thought slower, loved harder. And when those people speak, the wise ones listen. She didn't dress like them. She didn't speak like them. She didn't think like. Them and now? They don't think without her? She didn't fit their standards? Now, she is the standard. When the system finally worked, when the blinking lights returned, the process flowed smoothly, and the crisis that had consumed entire teams dissolved into silence. There was no applause, no immediate thanks, no standing ovation. There were only glances, short, hesitant, the kind of looks people give when they don't yet know how to admit they were wrong. The problem was fixed. The reports were filed. The engineers reassembled, documenting the new protocol, adjusting timelines, and sending polished updates to higher-ups. But the name behind the breakthrough? It wasn't mentioned. Not once. She stood in the background, just as she had when she first arrived. No fanfare, no celebration. Just her and her quiet understanding of what had just happened. Not just to the system, but to the people in that room. They knew. And that knowing burned in the silence more than any confession could. She had done what they couldn't. And yet, her name was left off the emails. Her voice was edited out of the meetings. Her contribution, like so many others before her, was tucked away beneath layers of ego, hierarchy, and pride. They gave her no credit, because giving her credit meant admitting that the gatekeepers had missed something big. That their titles didn't make them infallible. That wisdom doesn't always arrive in a lab coat or carry a badge. It arrives in unexpected places, and sometimes it wears the face of a woman no one thought to listen to. That kind of truth, it's uncomfortable. And so, they did what people often do when faced with uncomfortable truth. They buried it. But history doesn't forget like people do. It started quietly. A junior technician posted a blog entry about the real story about the woman no one credited, and the fix that saved the entire operation. Then a local reporter caught wind of it, then a podcast, then a viral video that asked the one question. No one in power wanted to answer, why was her name missing? The silence cracked. The world started to ask. Not just about the solution, but about her. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why wasn't she acknowledged? And in those questions, something powerful awakened. Same simplicity that once made her invisible, now made her unforgettable. They tried to downplay it at first, called it a team effort, said it was a collective breakthrough. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's rooted in something real. One by one, the facts lined up. Witnesses stepped forward. Footage emerged. The public began to see the full picture, and the woman who had once stood in the background was suddenly front and center. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She never wanted it. But the spotlight found her, not because of noise, but because of impact. She hadn't raised her voice. She had raised standards. She hadn't fought for recognition. She had earned it through quiet brilliance and courage. What followed wasn't just recognition. It was vindication. Invitations to speak. Features. In magazines, panels asking for her insight. Universities referencing her thinking in engineering ethics classes. Students writing essays on how one overlooked voice reshaped an entire outcome. And yet, through it all, she remained grounded. She didn't gloat. She didn't go on rants or call anyone out by name. Her revenge wasn't loud. It was legacy. The world now knew what those in that room refused to admit, that brilliance doesn't need permission. And truth doesn't stay buried forever. Her story became more than just an example of one woman's triumph. It became a warning to institutions, to teams, to every gatekeeper that ever silenced someone because they didn't fit the mold. It said, listen. Not to volume, but to value. Not to status, but to substance. Because when you ignore the quiet ones, you risk overlooking the very answers you've been chasing. And for her, the recognition didn't change her. It confirmed her. That everything she believed in, intuition, patience, perspective, it mattered. That standing firm even, when ignored, wasn't a waste. It was the foundation of everything that followed. Today, she walks into rooms with the same quiet grace. The same calm presence, but now. The room changes when she enters. Heads turn, people listen, not because they're told to, but because now they know better. They gave her no credit, but history gave her the spotlight. And when history speaks, it speaks forever. Thank you for being here. Your support means everything to us. More powerful stories are on the way. Real, raw, and unforgettable. Stay connected, subscribe, and never miss what comes next. Because the next story might just be yours.